Hi, let's talk about how to use the Beltsander, one of the most common tools used in cold working, grinding, and sometimes polishing glass. What we're going to be doing today is taking down one of our snow people, caterpillars, whatever you want to call this. We're going to turn the broken end here that was attached to the punty rod, and we're going to turn that into a round polished side just like this. And we're going to do that starting with the Beltsander, which is a softer tool. The belts are flexible. And then we're going to move to our polishing lathe, which we'll introduce in a minute. But first, let's talk safety. So the first thing to be aware of is broken glass. This room, the cold shop, is probably a more dangerous room than the hot shop. Because while the hot shop seems very dangerous, there's lots of heat and molten glass moving around, it's actually pretty difficult to burn yourself to death. On the other hand, broken glass, like those edges there, is one of the sharpest materials on earth, and you can cut yourself and bleed to death. So, absolutely essential working in this room, buddy system at all times. You need to be within earshot of someone in case you get into trouble. You're never working in the cold shop on your own. The other thing is eyewear. If you have prescription lenses, great. Wraparound safety glasses, better. Also, make sure that all of your hair is tied back, no long sleeves. Any jewelry, rings, and things are removed. Anything that might get caught in any of the equipment. This stuff is going to be spinning at very high RPMs and has a lot of force, a lot of power to it. The other thing to be aware of is respiratory concerns when we're working with grinding glass. Now, we are almost all of us now wearing masks, and especially in an academic environment, it's required that we wear masks. Now, these masks are not like this, approved dust mask. We just wearing cloth masks. So we're not so concerned that everybody needs a N95, especially that N95 masks are very difficult to come by now. If you have a respirator, if you have an N95, this is better for your respiratory health working with grinding and polishing glass, because glass powder, glass dust is very difficult to get out of your lungs. It's very heavy, and while your lungs can shed it, it's very difficult for it to do so. Now, just to be clear, when we're coming in here and we're grinding and polishing molten glass and turning molten glass into dust, that's still not crystalline silica. Even though we're using glass that is made out of silica, once it goes through the melting process, crystalline silica, which is the really dangerous stuff, the stuff that can build up in your lungs and cause silicosis and is irreversible, once we've melted crystalline silica into molten glass, it becomes amorphous silica. And amorphous silica can be shed from your lungs. It just is difficult for your lungs to do that. And so it's a bad idea to breathe this dust in no matter what. So anytime I'm in this room, in cold shop world, I have a dust mask, a approved N95, or the big respirator with the two big filters on the sides to make sure that I'm not breathing in any glass dust. So safety glasses, dust mask, and also hearing protection. Almost all of our equipment has one of these lying around. If you don't want to use, and we are trying to wipe these down and clean these, but if you don't want to use earmuffs that somebody else is using, we have a box of these lying around, individually wrapped, sterilized earplugs. Put those in. Those are the best. They're designed for use in factories. All these pieces of equipment in this cold shop make a lot of noise. So that covers your three basics. The rest of the stuff is cosmetic. So I'm wearing myself a nice apron here, and you probably don't want to wear anything nice. And I usually have on some kind of rubber boots or something because I know my feet are probably going to get wet. Every piece of equipment in here uses water, and that is to prevent, first off, a cloud of dust. The water keeps the dust down, and second, it is to keep the glass from overheating and cracking while you're working on it. So that takes care of safety stuff that are sort of general things. Now let's talk about safety when it comes to this particular piece of equipment. The first thing I'm going to do is get some of my belts. Now we keep ours in these little Tupperware containers that are all marked with the corresponding grid. I'm probably always going to start with 80. Now, a lot of places hang up their belts to dry when they're done. That's pretty common. And you'll hear a lot of people say, oh, you know, if you don't hang up the belt to dry, it'll shrink, then it won't be able to get back on the belt sander. And in my experience, at least these standard silicon carbide belts, I have never had that happen. We've been storing these in these Tupperware containers for 6 years now. And they have not shrunk, they always work, they always fit. The most important thing for us is that we can restore these belts back to their appropriate containers as a way to keep track of them. After a while, the numbers that are inside of these wear off. And if you're working on grinding on a piece of glass, once you get up to the higher numbers, 400 and 600 belts, it's real difficult to tell the difference between the two of those by feel. But you can tell the difference by sight of what it does to your glass. So, as soon as we finish using these belts, we put them back in the appropriate container. Doesn't matter if they're wet or not. That way we can keep track of them. So putting it on, there's a couple of different ways that these machines work. This one has a handle here. When I pull this, that wheel comes down. So I'm gonna put the belt around the wheels, pull down on that handle, and then slide the belt around the bottom of the other wheel. So let me show you exactly what's going on in there, what that looks like. So here we go. I want to make sure it's lined up here, and it's lined up down there on the bottom as well. And it should be fairly lined up here. Make sure this is closed so that it can't slide off there. And then over here we have our on-off switch. This is our water line that should always be on. When I flick this switch down here are a couple of little nozzles. They'll spray water out, and that's what will wet this belt down. If I turn the belt sander on and there is no water coming out, I immediately need to stop and assess what's going on. The first thing I would check is to make sure that valve on the wall, this valve here, is on. If that valve is not on, then I would take a minute and turn it on. Must be water. So let's see what this looks like when you're running it. So like I said, really loud piece of equipment. Not going to be able to hear me as I'm working on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the steps, some of the things that I'm going to be doing. I'm going to go through them without this machine on, and then I'll turn on the machine and you can see me sort of in process, okay? And then we'll talk about some of the little details of how I know where to go next, how I know when to move on, and when I'm finished with a certain belt. So the first thing is, as I'm working on this, I'm gonna work up here. Hold on, let me point this a little bit better. Move us in a little closer. All right. I'm gonna work right here on the belt where it's soft. I'm not gonna push on this wheel. As I'm working, you see I'm pushing here, it's deforming the belt. I'm going to make sure that I'm keeping my fingers and my hands away from these edges. This belt's gonna be spinning very, very, very quickly, and it could cut me. So I'm making sure that I'm keeping my hands away from that. I'm not gonna bump my fingers or whatever. I'm also making sure my fingertips are away from the belt itself. I have had instances where I have pushed a little bit and worn away a fingernail or something, and you can't tell, it's spinning so fast you can't really feel it. The other thing is making sure I'm supporting it from underneath. This belt is spinning, pushing this way. I don't want it to be like kicked out of my hand and smashed across the floor, which I have seen happen. So always supporting it underneath, and then turning with this hand and keeping my peripheral vision focused on staying away from these edges, okay? The other thing I'm gonna be doing is I'm gonna be turning a lot. I'm trying to turn this jagged side here into this, okay? Shiny and round. So I have to imagine this sort of broken edge starting to become a round thing, okay? So that's what I'm gonna be looking for. The first move I'm gonna be making on this 80 grit, which is very aggressive, is to round out the surface. So that's gonna be my shaping. From there, I'm gonna move to 120 and then 220 and so on. The belts work just like sandpaper. The lower the number, the coarser the grit. The higher the number, the finer the grit. And we're gonna go from 80 all the way to Cork, which is a pre-polish belt. And then we'll take this to the polishing lathe and use some cerium and some pumice to put the final polish on here. So I'm gonna turn this machine on, we'll see how I'm moving. Pay attention to how fast I'm gonna be turning it. I don't wanna stay in one spot because I'll make flat facets. I don't want this thing looking like a diamond when I come out, all flat-sided. What I want is it for it to be perfectly round. So to do that, I'm gonna push, deform the belt around it, like this, right? Pushing in, turning a lot, and then when I'm getting to where I want it to be round, I'll ease off my pressure, turn very lightly and very quickly, and do one of these here where I'm just making it round, okay? Just imagining that sort of like I'm running it like this and making it round. So I'll put my earplugs on, and fire it up. So if you look there, you can see I've got this sort of sanded area with a spot in the middle. That's because when this broke off, it did not break off cleanly. So I'm gonna stop right about here because I know that as I keep taking this in further with further grits, it's gonna remove more material. And probably by the time that I'm finished with the 220, this whole surface will be ground as well. I have to bear in mind that each belt will take off more material. So I'm gonna stop early. I'm not gonna shape this whole thing round with my 80. But how do I know when I remove the surface of this 80? That's the big thing. I need to know I have completely removed all the 80 grit so that I can move on from the 120 to the 220. Most of the time when people struggle polishing something, it is because they have not removed all signs of the 80. you have to grind through it entirely. So this is where skipping belts can be problematic. Not spending enough time on the particular belts can be problematic. But the Sharpie is your best friend cold working because it can track what you're doing. I usually stop after I've got my 80. You can sort of see that it's round, it's not faceted. It's scratched up, but that's just what 80 grit does. Put that to one side and then change my belt. By the way, I never go in here to change my belt unless this is stopped completely. I'm not reaching into that when it's running. Put my belt back into the corresponding container. And I'm going to grab a 120 belt. We have a great example here of how these belts wear. You can see that the 120 numbers are almost entirely worn off of here. That's why we make sure we put them back in the corresponding containers immediately. If you're working at a different studio and they had them hanging up, they usually are numbered, you'd always immediately take it off of here, hang it up based on the corresponding number so that you can't mistake them. It's just a respectful studio thing. So put it on, make sure they're all lined up. Close that up. Hearing protection, safety glasses on. I'm gonna go and remove all of that, and it's gonna come back slightly past the edge of that, okay? I'm gonna probably do that twice. Remove all the 80, the Sharpie, recoat it with Sharpie, remove it all again, and then I'll be ready to move on to the 220. So that's basically it. This looks a little bit damp, shiny right now because it is wet. So I'm gonna wait for it to dry. You can sort of see it drying there. Once it's dried, I can inspect it for scratches. I can actually already see one. I don't know if you can, right there. That shows me where there's some remnants of the 80 belt still left. So I'll need to coat this with Sharpie again, at least one more time. Go back over it with the 120 until it's gone, until all signs of the 80 are gone, and then I'll move on. So if I just do that with all the belts, all the way from 80 to 600 and then to Cork, that will take me all the way up to pre-polish. By the time I'm finished with Cork, it should look almost polished, okay? And then what we're gonna introduce next is moving on to our polishing lathe, okay? So normally this process for something about this size, when I'm doing my demos, going through all the steps probably takes a total of a half hour. If you're doing it for the first time, it'll probably take you that long. If it's taking you an hour, something is not quite right. You should seek help. Go back over the video and watch it again, but it shouldn't take that long to do if you're going through the steps appropriately. Sometimes if you skip a belt and you go, say, jump from a 80 to a 400, yeah, it's real hard to remove that 80 with a 400 belt, okay? Especially if it's not a fresh belt. And that brings up the fact that these belts do wear out. So if you're really working on it and you're like, man, I'm grinding on this 80, and I can't get it to like remove material, see if one of the people in charge of the studio that you're in, a grad student or an instructor or whatever, can put you in touch with a new belt, because they do wear out. That's just part of it. That's probably not the first thing that I would assume, is that it's the belt's fault, but that does happen. It takes a while for the belts to wear out, but they do wear out. So that's it. Remember, a dust mask to keep yourself from breathing particles, wraparound safety glasses, no loose clothing, jewelry, long hair, and hearing protection at all times. And absolutely, absolutely never work in this room by yourself, buddy system at all times, to make sure that somebody's within earshot to help you if something was to go wrong. Final couple of things I'll say about safety stuff. If you turn this machine on and this belt starts to ride one way or the other, don't try to stop it, just reach over, turn the machine off. This whole drum up here is adjustable, okay? It can tip this way or that way in order to keep the belt riding straight. Sometimes it gets a little loose and this drum tips this way and the belt wants to ride off, or tips the other way and the belt wants to ride that way. It's not a thing that you should concern yourself about normally, but it does happen. Don't ever try to grab the belt or stop it from sliding off. Just shut it down. It's no big deal. And then get someone to help you assess how to true up that belt on those wheels. All right, on the next session, we're going to talk about how to use our polishing lathe, cork, and felt wheel. See you then.